Jack Drake's team has discovered what caused the crash of Flight 255, but cannot prevent it from happening again. 1 year later in Dallas, Delta Flight 1141 tried to take off without their flaps extended. The investigators who had been working on the Northwest crash are stunned.
I was very frustrated to learn that another airline had done the same thing in a different aircraft type about a year later.
The Delta crash would uncover potentially deadly flaws in the checklists commercial pilots are trained to follow. The Delta and Northwest crashes killed 170 people and had eerily similar causes. In both disasters, the workload in the cockpit increased.
Jesus, look at this.
Northwest 255, now exited Charlie runway 3.
If we get out of here pretty quick, we won't have a delay. Auto land.
And in both, the pilots failed to perform vital elements of their checklists.
It is very unusual for a crew to not perform a checklist. They have done it hundreds upon hundreds of times.
Brakes, windshield heat is on, cabin pressure controller is checked.
The normal procedures were a little bit out of the norm, and as a result, it got overlooked.
To prevent this from happening again, aviation officials turned to a government agency that knows the importance of clear procedures.
4, 3, 2, 1.
NASA.
So they're in there, ready to go. All right.
Jack Drake and his team wanted the US Space Agency to help create checklists that decrease the odds of items being skipped. Asaf Degani was a research scientist working with NASA. After the accident, he took on the project of improving a flight crew's pre-takeoff procedure.
We looked for any research that was done on checklists or procedures in general, and in fact we couldn't find anything.
So Degani had to start from scratch. But there are dozens of different checklists to examine. Most of the ones on Flight 255 were printed on a single card. They listed the tasks the crew had to carry out, but didn't give them a way to keep track of what was and what wasn't done. At the time of the Northwest crash, there were several types of mechanical checklists in use. The US Air Force used a scrolling checklist. Once a checklist item is completed, the pilot scrolls to the next one. American Airlines used a system that allowed pilots to cover up completed items with a plastic slide, so only the non-completed items would be displayed. Asaf Degani set out to see firsthand how pilots were using checklists. He wanted to make it less likely for them to make mistakes. He sat in cockpits and observed 42 different crews in action. Degani concluded that many checklists were badly designed.
There's a certain flow by which you go about checking things, and the idea is to prevent a case where you're doing one thing here, one thing there. Checklist should have a certain flow, which is a logical flow, and not one which is kind of random. And they're ready, and they're going through there.
Degani also found a much more serious problem with checklists. If pilots are interrupted, they sometimes forget where they left off.
Transponder. Checked and on.
And there's many cases where people would do A, B, C, D, E, and air traffic call would come, they'd have to respond to it, and that's an interrupt.
Northwest 255, now exited Charlie runway 3 center.
They would go back to the checklist and skip a certain item and continue on the list, assuming that the whole list was done. People were very concerned about that.
To ensure no steps are missed, airlines train their pilots to return to the top of a checklist following the interruption and start over. Again, Asaf Degani sees a problem.
And we found that if checklists are very, very long and meticulous, that's overburdening the crew, and they sometimes would not want to start again from the beginning.
To address the problem, Degani suggests changes across the airline industry.
One of our recommendations from the study is to try to take long checklists and chunk them to small pieces so that if an interruption happens, then doing another 4 or 5 items, it's not a big effort as opposed to doing 20.
Degani even made recommendations about the typeface that airlines use, so they can be more easily read by pilots. Perhaps the biggest advance to checklists is the move from paper to computers.
Since at the time computer technology was coming into the cockpit, it made a lot of sense to think about the electronic checklist.
Today, Degani and his team are studying smart checklists that keep track of checked items. They provide pilots with a visual indication of where they are on the list, and in some cases verify that the task has been correctly carried out.
Electronic checklist shows you which item was completed and which item was not.
Computerized checklists are now slowly making their way into the cockpits of commercial airplanes. They make it far less likely that an accident like Northwest 255 could happen again. The FAA also ordered a modification to the alarm system of all commercial jetliners to prevent nuisance alarms. The takeoff warning was redesigned, so it could not sound unless the plane was actually taking off. Jack Drake went on to investigate hundreds of accidents over a 26-year career with the NTSB. The crash of Flight 255 taught him a valuable lesson.
This one is a worldwide example of the importance of following checklists and configuration being completed correctly on every takeoff. And so it became something that was a part of the training curriculum in virtually every airline around the world.
The case of Northwest 255 is no different. It was a series of events, runway change, task saturation, an overlooked checklist, a failed takeoff warning system. Put all of those together, those links in a chain, and you end up with the accident. If you were to break any one of those links, the accident wouldn't have happened.
Flight 255 will also be remembered for its lone survivor, Cecilia Sheehan. She's never spoken publicly about the death of her family. But she's stayed in touch with the people who rescued her that day.
She's full of life, and the conversations we have, it's more about, her sports and her husband and her vacations. She just said maybe one day she'll come out and tell the world what Cecilia is doing.